wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
The Vietnam War was still raging in 1968 when Richard Nixon was elected the nation's 37th president. Nixon vowed not only to bring the war to an end, but to begin a new effort to encourage freedom abroad. He believed that dealing directly with communist nations was the only way to introduce them to American democracy.
What happened after I became president was that I had to look at the world as I found it then. And I saw that with the Vietnam War going on, we had to make moves toward the Soviet Union, toward China, and others as well in order to build for the future.
In 1972, Nixon made an historic presidential visit to China and met with the communist leaders there. He also traveled to Moscow, the first president ever to do so. A groundbreaking nuclear arms control agreement would follow.
The United States could exist as an island of freedom in a world controlled by either Soviet or Soviet-leaning governments. But it would not be a very healthy or even safe world to live in.
But overshadowing all his diplomatic efforts abroad was the war in Vietnam and Nixon's increasingly secretive style of running it. Believing that military pressure would speed up the peace process, he expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos without telling Congress. Although he would eventually bring the Vietnam War to an end, his underhanded style of leadership would be his undoing.
We were obsessed with secrecy. As a matter of fact, I was paranoid or almost a basket case with regard to secrecy.
Nixon claimed executive powers intended for use in national emergencies and applied them to his own purposes.
The president does have certain extraordinary powers which would make acts that would otherwise be unlawful, lawful if undertaken for the purpose of preserving the nation.
With his own ideas of what would best preserve the nation, Nixon set up a secretly funded White House committee which forged documents, wiretapped civilians, and formed an enemy list of any American who might get in his way. It was a glaring assault on American freedom, but few in government or in the American public were paying nearly enough attention.
The thing that worries me the most is when people take freedom for granted, because freedom requires vigilance. It requires constant attention. When we are not alert to dangers to freedom, when we turn away because it's not affecting us, we're diminishing the freedom of everybody. So the one thing the story of freedom really tells you is that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
On the night of June 17, 1972, operatives of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President were arrested after breaking into the Watergate Hotel complex to steal documents from the Democratic Party headquarters. For more than a year, Nixon hoped what had become known as Watergate would blow over. But he underestimated the vigilance of the American press, and especially the investigative reporting of two journalists at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. As they began uncovering evidence of White House crimes, their reporting began to suggest a direct link to Nixon.
In recent months, members of my administration have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. The inevitable result of these charges has been to raise serious questions about the integrity of the White House itself.
Throughout the spring and into the summer of 1974, Nixon refused to comment further on Watergate.
We're going to stay on this job till we get the job done. And let others wallow in Watergate. We're going to do our job.
Then in August, secret tape recordings from Nixon's office proved he had been part of an illegal cover-up. 2 years and 2 months after the Watergate break-in, Richard Nixon addressed the nation.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
With Watergate and the war in Vietnam, our country was torn apart. People had lost faith in the government. If I, as president, could in any way bring about a healing, I thought it was a step in the right direction.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule.
Gerald Ford did help heal this country's wounds. Among other things, he offered amnesty to those who had fled to Canada to avoid fighting in the Vietnam War. But his official pardon of Richard Nixon cost him popular support, and he was unable to get elected in his own right. His successor was James Earl Carter, a peanut farmer who had risen to become Georgia's governor, and who was fervent about human rights and about freedom around the world.
The passion for freedom is on the rise. Tapping this new spirit, there can be no nobler nor more ambitious task for America to undertake than to help shape a just and peaceful world that is truly humane.
Carter worked hard to bring peace to the Middle East, one of the most tumultuous and war-torn areas on Earth. The Middle East peace talks, as the negotiations between Israel and Egypt were called, would be the finest achievement of Carter's presidency. But many in the Muslim world were unhappy with the peace treaty and angered by America's influence in the region. And in 1979, the Shah of Iran, one of America's closest allies in the Middle East, was driven from power. He was succeeded by the Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shiite religious leader who preached hatred of the United States. In November, a group of militant Irani students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American hostages. State Department employee Robert O'D was among them and recorded his experience in a diary.
We were surrounded by a group of the students who were armed and then marched to the embassy residence. I was taken upstairs, put alone in a rear bedroom, and blindfolded. I strongly protested the violation of my diplomatic immunity, but these protests were ignored.
There was a time of great stress for me. That's while the hostages were being held, when I was obsessed with preserving their lives and bringing them back home safely. This nation will never yield to blackmail, but we will not rest nor deviate from our efforts. until all have been freed from their imprisonment and their abuse.
Today, we begin the 10th month of our captivity. Still, there is nothing doing that makes me feel that we will get out of here soon. I just can't understand what our government is doing to obtain our release. It's very, very discouraging.
I would meet personally with the families of the hostages and try to reassure them of my interest. So that was a very bad time.
The crisis in the Middle East led to an oil shortage in the United States and to high inflation. And despite his efforts during 443 days, Jimmy Carter was unable to obtain the release of the hostages.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
On the 444th day, the very day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated president, January 20th, 1981, the 52 hostages were released.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free.
The voice came over the plane speaker. You are now leaving Iranian airspace. What a cheer went up from the American hostages. Now we knew we were really free. We were going home.
In 1982, Ronald Reagan sent Marines into Lebanon as part of a peacekeeping force to help restore order to that war-ravaged country. Muslim radicals responded with a terrifying war tactic. In October of 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck loaded with explosives into a U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 Marines.
We have to come to grips with the fact that today's terrorists are better armed and financed. They are more sophisticated. They are possessed by a fanatical intensity that individuals of a democratic society can only barely comprehend.
But terrorists would prove to be elusive targets. Over the course of his presidency, Ronald Reagan used the word freedom over and over again in his speeches and press conferences. He used it as the rationale for a conservative domestic agenda, and he used it to describe his foreign policy. When he announced his desire to sit down and talk peace with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, it marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
There stands before the entire world one great and inescapable conclusion. Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom replaces the ancient hatreds among nations with comity and peace. Freedom is the victor.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, a great sign to the world that freedom was spreading. That same year, students in China rebelled against their totalitarian government. They marched with a statue called the Goddess of Democracy, modeled after America's Statue of Liberty. Li Lu was one of the student leaders in Tiananmen Square.
The old man who ruled China sent the army to silence us. But the old man could not silence us. The roar of tanks and machine guns can never crush dreams of freedom.
But dreams of freedom in China were crushed as the student protests in Tiananmen Square were brutally suppressed. And around the globe, Instead of ushering in a new era of international peace, the end of the Cold War was followed by new problems. With ethnic hatreds resurfacing widely, violent wars erupted in places like Bosnia and Rwanda. And then came Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and an American and UN military operation known as Operation Desert Storm. Critics claim the real motive for fighting was oil. President George Bush insisted it was a matter of principle, and that Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, had to be stopped.
The evil against the good was so clear, it made it very easy for me. It was an easy call for me on principle, not on execution. I think Desert Storm lifted the morale of our country and healed some of the wounds of Vietnam. I'm sure of it.
As president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
In fact, a much broader, invisible war was escalating as fundamentalist extremism continued to spread throughout much of the Muslim world. And over the next decade, during the presidency of Bill Clinton, membership was rapidly expanding in a secret terrorist network known as Al-Qaeda.
I came to this hallowed chamber 2 years ago on a mission to restore the American dream for all our people and to make sure that we move into the 21st century still the strongest force for freedom and democracy in the entire world.
As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Americans were enjoying a booming, self-confident period of affluence. But few people seem to be paying attention to worsening poverty at home or to the mounting levels of anger and resentment abroad. There had been plenty of warnings. Al-Qaeda terrorists had struck repeatedly in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, in the destruction of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, and in the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen. But despite these attacks, in the late summer of 2001, most Americans were unaware that a holy war had been declared on the United States. The fundamentalist militant Osama bin Laden had called it the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans and work to destroy free society in the Western world. On the morning of September 11, 2001, followers of bin Laden carried out his threat.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. The advance of human freedom, the great achievement of our time and the great hope of every time, now depends on us. Freedom and fear are at war.
America committed itself to a war against terrorism and to an unprecedented tightening of its own national security. In the months that followed, a widespread debate took place about how to properly balance security and freedom.
Obviously, security is of tremendous importance to anybody. I mean, remember, one of the 4 freedoms that President Roosevelt mentioned was freedom from fear. But I think it would be self-destructive to, in any significant way, limit our freedoms in order to protect our security. After all, ultimately, our security is supposed to protect our freedom. And if we start limiting the right to dissent, if we start stigmatizing people because they come from one portion of the world or another, or because they follow one religion or another, we may end up with a great deal of security and not nearly enough liberty. One must always be conscious that freedom is a very fragile thing which needs to be protected and can never be taken for granted.
July 4th, 2002. 10 months after the surprise attack of September 11th, this country celebrated what Abraham Lincoln once described as a new birth of freedom. Many Americans were now feeling for the first time in their lives a surge of patriotism and bravery, and an overwhelming sense of how precious our freedom is and how we must protect it. Over the past 2 centuries, this country's vision of freedom has become more and more powerful and more inclusive. And American freedom has gotten millions of people from all over the world dreaming and hoping. Langston Hughes, an African-American poet, was one of those dreamers. His words remind us all that the struggle for freedom is not over and never will be.
Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain must bring back our mighty dream again. Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me. And yet, I swear this oath, America will be.
From sea to shining sea. From sea to shine.